Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Cambridgeian for tonight's debate, which is on the motion, very topical motion, this House believes multiculturalism isn't working. For those of you who are new here tonight, the format is a series of alternating speeches of 8 minutes each. We'll go proposition, opposition, and then so on. As you may know, you can make a speech at any time if the speaker chooses to accept you. If you'd like to make a point of information, just stand up, say point of information, state your name and college before you speak. And please do keep points of information to a maximum of 1 minute. I think that's all from me. So without further ado, we will crack on with the main debate. Our first speaker this evening is Rami Ranger, Dr. Rami Ranger. Rami is the founder of the British Sikh Association and also founder of Asian Conservative Link. Rami.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give my views that multiculturalism has failed in Britain. Before I do, I would like to tell you that I have first-hand experience of the consequences of different cultures fighting for their own interest and not that of a nation. I'm narrating my story to you so that you can appreciate the repercussions of multiculturalism going wrong. My father was assassinated 2 months before my birth for opposing the breakup of India on the basis of religion in 1947. Politicians encouraged multiculturalism in India for power and divided communities which had lived side by side for centuries. Over 1 million innocent people became victims of sectarian killing, and over 30 million became persona non grata in their own country. Those who used to live as one have now become nuclear adversaries and have fought several bloody wars since. The consequences of their division are being felt until today. I arrived in a refugee camp in India with my mother and 7 siblings at the age of 2 months. Luckily, we had a remarkable mother who worked hard as a teacher and brought us up through immense difficulty, having lost her ancestral home, country, and love of her life, or our breadwinner. She also instilled the right values in us, which have become the bedrock for our success. I am probably the only one in Britain to have earned royal honours 6 times on merit, 5 times for business and once personally for community service. This was possible because from the moment I arrived in the UK, I sought to integrate. Those who look back cannot look forward. I retained my religion and culture but adopted the best of what Britain had to offer. As a result, I lost nothing but gained much more, and the result is in front of you. Recently, David Cameron, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy have also stated that multiculturalism has failed in Europe. This is the conclusion of leaders from 3 cosmopolitan, progressive and diverse countries having seen parallel society mushrooming in their own countries, societies which do not seem to want to integrate with the indigenous population. These leaders and their predecessors had envisaged culturally diverse Europe working together. Instead, the term melting pot was once used to describe how people from varied backgrounds would come together and assimilate into indigenous culture. Instead, they got Europe, where societies within a society are all too often working against each other and stubbornly resisting any change from their own cultural practices. Unfortunately, some politicians have played on these differences and divided community for their own gains. For votes, they conveniently appease communities and encourage them to continue to live as they had lived in their own country. They even changed institutions which served us for centuries to make immigrants feel at home. Instead of promoting a common national pride, grants were offered to communities to have their separate cultural and religious center to promote their separate identity. No attempt was made to unite the masses. Instead, a system was given to remain separate. Their divide and rule policy may have benefited them temporarily, but it has rendered a permanent loss to the nation in terms of social cohesion. We now have ghettos in many parts of Britain, where many cultures live side by side without social cohesion. This has led to the indigenous people often feeling marginalized, and in many places, immigrant communities are resented. Regrettably, political correctness in Britain has gone too far, and anyone who dares to question it is deemed racist. As a result, many communities have been left at the fringes of society with an immense loss to them and to the nation as a whole. Newly arrived immigrants were encouraged to follow their cultural practices alien to Britain, which made it difficult for them to integrate into mainstream. I was not against this until I realized that some people have lived in Britain for years and still could not speak English or appreciate British values which made Britain great in the first place. Let me give you one simple example of culturally alien practice to Britain. The average family in Britain needs 2 incomes to make ends meet. However, if someone does not allow his wife to go out to work for cultural reasons, then that person unwittingly creates a parallel society, one in which women can go out to work to provide a second income, thus enabling a higher standard of living. The other, where women are prevented from going to work, will naturally struggle to make ends meet. The family may have to rely on state welfare to get by. The nation loses out on second set of income tax along with productivity. A woman staying at home will not have the opportunity to integrate or to interact with society. As a result, she will not be equipped to guide her children in becoming integrated citizens of Britain. What she cannot experience or relate to herself, she will not be able to pass on to her children, and the vicious circle will continue. God forbid, if her husband was to die prematurely, he would leave behind a wife unable to deal with complexity of the modern world and a mother unable to look after her children. The state might have to foot the bill for the family, and the children would have to fend for themselves in this uncaring world. Moreover, less income, larger family can in fact become a recipe for radicalization for some due to the sheer resentment against those who benefit for 2 income and enjoy a better standard of living. We must discourage cultural practices which keep us at a disadvantage and do not allow us to integrate to achieve true potential of the country. Everyone who lives in Britain becomes a part of Britain, and as a result must move in the same direction to build a cohesive society to benefit everyone, including our next generation. I feel we may need to take a look at the American model. It is a pluralistic society, and they have set the tone for everyone to be American first and foremost, and everything else thereafter. We have failed to instill this value in immigrants coming to Britain. American flags are flown freely at home and public buildings as a symbol of unity and national pride. We, on the other hand, allowed our Union Jack to be hijacked by right-wing racist party. The result, our flag of union sometimes appeared to be a flag of division. For multiculturalism to work, there has to be mutual respect for all cultures, and everyone should move in the same direction while enjoying diversity. Let's take the example of scaffolding. Each steel bar is held together for common purpose. The result, a strong structure which allows progress to take place. However, if each steel bar was allowed to point in whichever direction it chooses, then it would be nothing more than a mess. We now have think tanks which spend vast amount of money and time discussing integration and how to ensure that we have a cohesive society. They are the same recommendation that I took for granted when I arrived in the UK. To speak the language, understand the country, respect its rules and laws, and take on a sense of British pride. It seemed a little too late to hope that the sense of national pride from the Olympic will undo what has been allowed to go wrong for many years. In any case, we now have one country and queen. As a result, we must consider ourselves to be one or allow multiculturalism to divide us further as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Opening the case for the opposition is Professor Lucinda Platt. Lucinda is a professor of sociology at the University of London and also director of the Millennium Cohort Study, which is a well-known study that followed the lives of 19,000 children. Lucinda.
I was interested to hear in the first talk that the vision of the speaker seemed to be one of a multicultural society where there was mutual respect for all cultures and allowing diversity and difference. I think this is what seems to be what both sides therefore are supporting as the idea of a multicultural society, and one which I think there are good reasons to say is largely the model in Britain today. I also heard a lot of claims about lack of cohesion and lack of British pride, lack of willingness to integrate. I think these claims are heard a lot, and I'm, as an academic, I'm interested in investigating them directly. So I've had quite a detailed look at what the evidence says about how people do interact, how they feel about Britishness, and whether there is actually the separation that's often claimed. And I find very little empirical evidence for it. There also drawn attention to, as well as the issues around national pride and cohesion, which you might call the national identity story, was the issues around poverty and inequality and quality of incomes. And I think, again, these are rightly pointed out as a challenge to multicultural society, but I would take issue with them actually being demonstrably, the multiculturalism is demonstrably seen to be not working for these reasons. So if I first turn to the issue of Britishness and pride and willingness to integrate, I think it's worth noting that ethnic minorities in the UK today have a higher average sense of Britishness across each of the groups than the majority does. There is a real commitment to expressing a strong sense of Britishness. And this increases over time in the country, and most importantly, I think, if you're thinking about multiculturalism working, it increases across generations. There is the second generation are demonstrably more likely to feel a strong sense of British than the first, and this is much stronger among minorities from the second generation than from the majority. This suggests that parents are doing a good job if that's one measure of integration and British pride. So, point?
Are you familiar with a report I read recently, Living Together Apart?
I'm not.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that was under the auspices of one of the departments in the Council of London, and that seemed to have a fairly large evidence base to suggest absolutely the opposite. In fact, that the second and third generation, primarily from South Asian backgrounds, had far less attachment to a sense of British identity.
Well, there's a difference of evidence then. Mine is nationally representative studies, and I've seen it across a number of different studies, so I'm backing my own evidence on this one. Thank you. I think it's also evident from the research I've done that ethnic minorities and also the majority seem comfortably able to manage dual identities, and a strong minority identity is not necessarily inconsistent with a strong British identity, and actually in some cases may reinforce it. Feelings of Britishness are sensitive to racial harassment. This doesn't undermine the overall picture, but those who feel that they've been experienced racial harassment have a weaker sense of Britishness than those who don't feel this. But I don't think I think that simply serves to reinforce the multicultural model, and that respecting difference and therefore not subjecting people to racial harassment increases their pride and their sense of Britishness. Interestingly, given a lot of the claims in this area, it's Pakistani Muslims who are in fact the most likely of all the minority groups to hold strong dual identities. And they have a very strong sense of Britishness. And again, this is an intergenerational issue. I think we can see these patterns of non-separation, if you like, of integration, again, across a number of areas, increasing over generations. This suggests that the multicultural model is working. Whatever people come with, this does change over time. You can see this, for example, in the increase in interethnic friendships. You can see it in the increase in interethnic partnerships. This is the case across all minority groups, and across the majority for that matter, even if it starts from different bases. Patterns of education and attainment are very different in the first generation, but they're still quite distinctive across groups in the second generation, but they're much more similar. They do converge, and in particular, the qualifications that women from minority groups are getting in the second generation are converging strikingly.
Thanks. Can you just explain what you mean by the multicultural model and how that differs from integrationism on that side?
I think, as I started to say, I think the vision of the multicultural model from this side was very similar to my vision of the multicultural model. I think you could say it's the recognition of group difference within the public sphere of laws, policies, democratic discourses, and the terms of shared citizenship and national identity. So it's an important recognition of respecting difference while having a shared sense of national identity. And I think that's what I'm demonstrating from my examples. Okay, so I think I would now like to turn to the second point about what we might call the social justice agenda. That multiculturalism has been and might be criticised, though this receives, interesting, a lot less attention, if it's seen to be failing minority groups in terms of providing them equal opportunities, equal access to the same sorts of labour market and welfare opportunities as other groups, if they are subject to discrimination and harassment and so on. And I think that the picture here from the research I've done, again using a large range of nationally representative data sets, has shown that the picture is somewhat more complex, but there is, again, a clear story of convergence, especially convergence across generations. In terms, I've mentioned qualifications converging across generations, employment levels in the population, there is much more convergence in the second generation. Women's employment levels from some groups are higher than the majority average, from some minority groups, for example, Black Caribbean women's, from some groups are strikingly lower, for example, first generation in particular Pakistani and Bangladeshi women, but they increase substantially in the second generation. I think it would be wrong to say that wrong to expect that all groups would reach an equal level by immediately within one generation, but what is striking is that there is greater convergence. Many minority groups have achieved striking levels of upward mobility, and they've done this through obtaining educational qualifications. And this is the case for many minority groups. They've overcome situations of disadvantage to a greater extent than the majority population in some cases. Again, this seems to demonstrate that there is potential for the multicultural model and that it is working for some groups, though again it's not consistent across all groups. And for some groups, even despite getting qualifications, they're still not getting the same sorts of opportunities. So there are modifications to that story. And household income levels were mentioned earlier, and there are striking differences in household income levels, but household income levels aren't just determined by having two working members. They're also largely determined, in large part determined by pay and by family and household choices about welfare in the context of different levels of pay. And I think you've got to treat people as making rational decisions in that context, rather than saying that it's necessarily about preventing women from working. So in terms of the social justice story, I think it is a more complicated story, but I think there is clear indication that the multicultural model is working on many dimensions, and I think we can acknowledge the role of things like the having very early race discrimination legislation in this country compared to other countries as being a marker of why Britain is perhaps more successful than many other countries. And I think in terms of what's more often talked about, the national identity story and claims about lack of cohesion, integration, pride in Britishness, I think the evidence is clear-cut. And we do indeed see that in large part the multiculturalism in Britain is working very well and is changing changing across generations and across time.
Thank you, Lucinda. We will take a very short floor round now, as well as later on. So if you do want to make a floor speech, please state your name and college before you speak, and keep your speeches to a maximum of 1 minute, as well as waiting for a microphone to reach you before you start speaking. Does anyone have an initial point they'd like to make in proposition of the motion? Down there.
Tristan Roberts, Corpus Christi. Professor Platt, you mentioned quite a lot about how there's convergence in these groups to the national average. Surely this implies that people are, in fact, integrating rather than Britain remaining multicultural, and therefore that multiculturalism has actually failed.
I think it depends what you expect as a multicultural model. As I said, I expected it to be a recognition of difference, and I think the first speaker put it very well where he said he expected to be able to be at a personal and individual level to have his cultural and religious identity respected, but that doesn't necessarily imply that you should therefore experience deprivation and lack of qualifications as a result. I think multiculturalism very much suggests that people will participate in a common good, and it's not just about converging to the practice of others, it's about people converging together as well, and this comes from both sides.
Anyone like to make a point in opposition? Yeah.
Vlad Clare Hall. The question is whether multiculturalism is working, so we need to set a standard by which we can say whether it's working or not. Now, of course, we're not all holding hands and frolicking around fields, and that would be an unrealistic expectation. So we should set out a reasonable comparison with similarly placed countries. There's two examples that do integrationism. America does culture integrationism, and France does political integrationism. It's all about citizenship and so on. Now, there are ghettos in London, yes, there are ethnic ghettos, they're poor, so on and so forth. The police can go in them. The police in the US can't go in inner city slums. The police in France, in Paris, can't go in inner city slums. If you look directly at the relevant comparisons, yes, ethnic minorities segregate, they're poorer, but it happens to far less extent in Britain than in the relevant comparative examples. And one last comparison, 30 years ago to now. Brixton Riots, it was racially motivated, it was black people reacting against the system, it didn't work, it was essentially a racist environment. The riots 2011, well, basically it was represented all round, and it was about poverty and class, not about race. If that to me says that multiculturalism in this country is working, not as well as one would hope, but it's working.
And finally, for now, does anyone have a point they'd like to make in abstention of the motion? Please. Right up there.
Charlie Shotton, Emmanuel College. I think perhaps both sides of the argument here are operating on a rather narrow view of multiculturalism, perhaps one that historically may have worked. But in our rapidly globalizing world, I would argue that actually multiculturalism is far more about the connections with other cultures through business, media, communication, that actually those cultures blend together over those platforms rather than simply people being integrated or not within a new culture.
Thank you, Charlie. We will have another floor speech round later, but to get back to our main debate, we have John IONIDES. John is an officer of Cambridge City Conservatives. John.
Okay, so I'm afraid I'm a bit of a stand-in. This may well be the shortest speech the union has witnessed for a while because I haven't had a chance to practice it at all. First, a little bit of a background about me, and you'll see that this has some relation to the motion. As you might be able to tell from my name, my family does not originate from this country. In fact, my great-great-great-great-grandfather would have been Greek if there was a Greece to be part of at that time. And recently a cousin got very excited when she traced the family tree back to Alexios Komnenos, who some of you with a good knowledge of Byzantine history might realize was emperor back at the time of William the Conqueror. So I apologize for the Second Crusade. Seems to be trendy at the moment. So you might, now, when I was called up this afternoon and asked whether I'd stand in, the first thing I did was got on the phone to my wife and said, "Daraga Shmegaya, could you come home early to look after the kids? I'm going to do a speech at the union," from which those of you who are linguistically aware will tell that we speak some bastardized version of Russian and English at home, and that at least one of us is Jewish, in this case, my wife. So why on earth would I be speaking for this motion? I think we need to look very carefully at what we're talking about here. As a number of people have commented, it all depends about what you mean by multiculturalism, and in this context, the way in which multiculturalism has been implemented, both at a policy level and in how it is understood on the ground. And I'd also like to draw a distinction here between multi-ethnicity and multiculturalism. And I think the Olympics was an interesting example. There are a number of gloating posts after Mo Farah won his foot races, saying, "Oh, look, isn't multiculturalism great?" And I would actually argue that wasn't a multicultural event. That was a monocultural event. Everybody in the country, regardless of their ethnicity, got together and witnessed an event together. Okay? So I think we need to be very careful about what we're talking about here. Now, what do we mean by multiculturalism? Now, I'm a grassroots politician. I work, I knock on doors, I go and help support the elected members. So what I'm interested in is not so much what a think tank or what a university thinks about what multiculturalism is, but what it means to the people on the ground, what it means to the people at the coalface of the public services, how they interpret it, what it means to them. And what I tend to find, I am afraid I'm going to disagree with the good professor, is that they actually see this as encouraging independent cultures to go their independent ways. Okay? So if I have a pot of money that I want to put in to support cultural awareness, multiculturalism, it will be to help a Chinese culture put on a Chinese art show or something like that. In other words, it's promoting the sustainability of the individual cultures. And to one extent, there's nothing wrong with that. But we'll come to the problems side later. And this is generally seen as opposed to an assimilation or integration, which, as my wife reminded me from her Jewish background, are considered somewhat separate. Now, in terms of these subcultures, this ghettoization, if you like, I actually tend to support the speaker over there. The experience that I have seen, the anecdotal evidence that I have heard, supports to quite a large extent the ghettoization, not only actually in the urban areas. If you go out to the Fens and you look at the Lithuanian, Polish communities out there, they are fairly ghettoized. It might be 25% of the population in some villages. I believe that my background is as a biochemist, and I take an awareness of all aspects of biology, and that human beings have a fundamentally tribal instinct, and this actually affects both sides of this argument. At the one level, where the group of people, I've actually lived as an immigrant. I've lived in Russia for a while, so I know what it's like going to a new culture. And there is a tendency to want to cling together with people who share similar cultural roots. But at the same time, actually, a nation, I think, works best if there is some common cultural basis to that nation. So we have to take into account the tribal instinct, but be aware that it plays to both sides of this argument. So why is what I would call sort of the orthodox model that I have seen of multiculturalism in the UK, which tends to promote the sustainability of independent subcultures, why is it possibly a problem? And I did a bit of a straw poll, phoned around this afternoon. I was speaking to this chap who was actually stuck in France, but he said, well, as a gay man, I get very, very concerned. I'm uneasy about giving moral equivalence to subcultures who say that I, at the best, am criminal and at worst should be killed. Okay? And can we actually accommodate sensibly all these subcultures? Should we accommodate all these subcultures and give them moral equivalence? I think we need to be very careful about this. Well, you say, is this not cultural imperialism? Are we not just imposing our views on all these different people or peoples? And I would say, well, you could see it like that, but in many ways, the thing that I think people are really worried about is those who say, well, our culture is better than yours. Okay? In other words, they're clinging to their own culture. They're trying to make comparisons, say, no, I'm going to do what I do because I think it's better. And in many ways, if we're talking about cultural isolationism or sustainability of independent cultures, I think that that is a real problem. That we have those people within those independent cultures who are saying, well, I'm going to stick to my culture because it's better. And in actual fact, the cultural imperialism works both ways. It's not just the majority culture imposing on the minorities. It's the minorities going, no, we are going to impose on the majority. And that can also create considerable problems. The second is that, in fact, across the political spectrum, okay, I'm a conservative, I will see this in terms of the big society, but Labour friends here will see this in terms of the common good. These rely on a coherent sense of community to really work properly. If you're going to ask people to make sacrifices, be it through taxation or whatever, to help those within a community, it is extremely helpful if that is a coherent community. And I think that it is much, much harder, therefore, when we have sub-communities, as I said, this ghettoization, to expect the general taxpayer or taxpayers who identify with other communities or possibly even reject the majority community or one of the minority communities to pay up. I want to give a couple of local examples, contrasting. Last weekend, I was talking to a number of county councillors out in the Fens. Now, we live in a relatively affluent corner of Cambridgeshire. A lot of North Cambridgeshire is not the same as that. And there was a major problem with Eastern European immigration, as they see it. There are sometimes, let's say, 25% of a village. There are new smells, there are new sounds. The village that was probably been a single family for 600 years no longer feels like their village. And I think that this is a real problem. Now, my wife pointed out there is also an issue of taxation. She's a good Russian. She pays her taxes, but she knows that a number of her compatriots are, shall we say, more liberal. It only works, this only works, the common good, the big society, only works if everybody feels part of a single society. At a university level, in Cambridge, we see the exchange of ideas and experience at a premium. And so multiculturalism, I think, is instinctive to many people here. But across the UK, most of it, I assure you, is like the Fens. It's not like Cambridge here. Okay, so what I'm going to say is that the road that British multiculturalism is taking is not the most efficient. Yes, shared cultural expression can be very good, but the model that we have in the UK is not working properly. And therefore, I call for you to support the motion.
Thank you, John. To continue the debate, we have Parmjit Dhanda. Parmjit was, until the last election, a Labour MP and is the only Minister of Indian Heritage to have served in the British government. Parmjit.
Can I say, firstly, what an honour it is to be sat next to the author of Rasta Mouse. And secondly, my 3-year-old is going to be very impressed in the morning when I tell him. But what an honour it is to be here at the Cambridge Union as well. If you told me 30-odd years ago I'd end up here, I'd have assumed I'd have to climb over a wall to get here, let alone be invited. I'm going to play around with a question a little bit, because the question is about whether multiculturalism has failed or succeeded in our country, because I don't think anybody would doubt the fact that we've been a multicultural country. but where has it taken us and where is it taking us? And also I think some very fair questions have been raised, not least by the last speaker, about how we spend our money. Is it about supporting separate projects? Do we promote the overall brand? And I think most speakers in this debate could actually give a little and take a little from both sides of it. I'm a big fan of multiculturalism. I must say, in my time I was lucky enough to be a Minister for Community Cohesion. I had responsibility for race and faith issues. And even now in this country you get some quizzical looks. Oh, the minister's arrived. Is that him? I was a bit younger then, you see. But, and you get some quizzical looks. And I used to kick off a lot of my debates by describing myself. And how do you describe yourselves these days? I said my parents are from the Punjab. I grew up in West London. I represented Gloucester. I support Liverpool at football, started to lose the audience at that stage. Support Gloucester at rugby. And yes, I admit, failed the Norman Tebbit cricket test by supporting India against England at cricket. Now, for me, that is part of Britain today. That is diversity, and that is what we are about. And I do disagree, ever so slightly, with the previous speaker when he talks about the Olympic Games. Look, on a bad day, on a negative day, I'd probably propose the motion. But I think that is a triumph of fear over hope for the future. And also, I think rather unfair when you look at some of the research. And I'll come on to that in just a moment. On my bad days, we got LEROY Logan here. I used to see him on the television growing up, talking about things like the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, a lad just 3 or 4 years older than me. And for me, growing up as an angry young man in London, I'd have said, my goodness, our society and our multiculturalism has failed him, it's failed his family, and we've seen that again and again and again. But then we look at last summer. Yes, we all appeared to celebrate that golden 45 minutes when a mixed-race woman, a black refugee from Somalia, and a white ginger bloke as well, let's not forget him, all won gold medals in the space of 45 minutes. But we also had Aidan Burley just a couple of days prior to that, sorry Paul, I know he's a colleague of yours, saying about the opening ceremony that enough of this multicultural claptrap. So multiculturalism is different things to different people. And for him, it was about that celebration of diversity in all of those different cultures, which to me make Britain so great and made the Olympics such a wonderful thing. Now, the Joseph Rowntree Trust have done some really interesting research here. A lot of that research is about the spread of diversity. And there's an acceleration taking place out there. Looking around this room, I bet it looks a lot different to how it would have looked 10 or 20 years ago, probably even more so than 5 years ago. There is an acceleration that some people will be frightened of because it's uncontrollable. Is that a bad thing? Is that something for us to fear? Well, what I say is this. In my experience as an elected representative, or as a minister as well, where people were afraid of multiculturalism, where they were afraid of diversity, wasn't in those areas where there was multiculturalism and diversity in different races and different faiths. It was invariably in those communities half a mile or 2 miles down the road, which were homogenous, but saw what was going on down the road and lived in fear of it. But everybody was actually getting on relatively well in those diverse, multicultural communities. So I don't think we need to fear that acceleration. And I think sometimes in Britain we just need to be a bit more optimistic. There's a lot of things to be down about. I get pretty peeved myself about a lot of things that are happening. But according to the EHRC, 80% of people in this country say they are treated with respect. It's lower actually amongst the black community, about 75%. So, let's be aware of that. And let's be aware of the challenges. But still, those are pretty good figures. And for you, as a union, and as young people compared to most of us that are speaking tonight, I think there's also a really important lesson for us to learn. Because again, from the research, the acceptance of diversity amongst young people is far greater than it is amongst older people. 1 in 8 households in this country now have more than one ethnic group. Now look, I think we've got some serious challenges around multiculturalism, about community cohesion more so in the coming years. The benefits and the advantages are young people are actually living with it and growing with it, and that acceleration, I think, is helping to improve things. The challenge and the downside and the difficulties we're going to have, and if we're honest about it, have had, this government is having it, the last government had, is about the pace of change and the cohesion, whether it's within our schools and the different languages that are spoken, and how people rub along. But there is an economic imperative here as well. When my parents came to this country in the 1960s, my mother often tells me the story. My mother was a cleaner in Ealing Hospital. My dad was a truck driver. My mother didn't speak any English. Like all the other Asian women who were cleaners on the shift, one group would come off, another group would come on, all Asian women. And from time to time, people would come up to her because they had their own views of multiculturalism and diversity and what it meant to them. And they'd say, people like you just come here to take our jobs. She couldn't reply to that in words, but she was very good at thrusting a mop into their hands and saying, you do it. And invariably, the answer came back, no thanks. We are an aging society. We've got big challenges ahead. Right now, 1 in 6 of our population are pensioners. That will soon be a quarter by the year 2050. If we want to give them pensions, if we want to give them affordable social care, then we need to continue that change, and we need to be continuing to accept the need for working people from around the world to make a difference in this country. And we always have, my concluding remarks, whether it was the Angles, the Saxons, the Normans, you name it. That's the history of Britain, and something we should be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you. And to continue the case for the proposition, we have FLETCHER WILLIAMS. Fletch has a Master's in Peace Studies and has written a number of conference papers on the subject. Fletch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for having me here this evening. The idea that multiculturalism isn't working, I want to discuss a little bit about what I mean by this. A few speakers have tried to clarify a bit more on the issue, and there still seem to be confused faces in the room, so we'll try again. I don't think that when I say multiculturalism isn't working, that I mean that it can't ever work. I don't think that I mean that it doesn't currently work in some places. I think there are some places where it works very well. I also don't mean that it doesn't mean that people of different identities should all be put in the same school, and when they all miraculously manage to get jobs and GCSEs, that means it's all working fine. I don't mean that either. I'm also not going to talk about the Olympics, mainly because it was an event in a stadium that I didn't watch, but because also I think multiculturalism is about experiences that people have firsthand, not something that they just see on TV, but when they walk down the street, how people interact with them. And we heard a little bit of respect as well from the previous speaker. So why isn't it working, I guess? I don't think it's working in a lot of places because people are fearful about what they see, because they aren't as well off as a lot of people in the southeast of England, where a lot of people in this room will come from, and because they're fearful of their jobs and the situation that they find themselves in. I also don't think that integration is something that allows for multiculturalism, because as Rami said, integration means taking something from other cultures and then changing how you live to be more like other people. That means that you're creating a new culture in the singular. It doesn't mean that you're coexisting with multiple cultures like that. So let's kind of move on to the idea about where these problems might be. If they're not necessarily, I mean, there are places in London where it's a problem, but if they're not mostly in the south east, where might they be? We're talking about places like Glasgow, places like Stoke, places like Bradford, which are famously divided places where the police can't go into a lot of those places in those cities, or places like Northern Ireland, where culture means something different. It's not necessarily whether you're from India or your parents were from India and other people are from England, but it's about whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant. And the police have an active policy there of having to hire people in accordance to what their culture is, because they know that there are places where only people from certain cultures can go. And there are many places in the UK where that is the problem. I don't think that there's therefore saying like, oh, well, in France they have this problem, we don't have this problem here, isn't really a fair comparative in that way, because multiculturalism does mean different things in different places. Stoke is a very interesting example, and one that I'd like to talk about a bit more, because when we look at our environment, our political environment, where parties like the BNP and UKIP and significant proportions of the Conservative Party as well are able to exist and garner significant amounts of support, we surely have to question how successful the multiculturalism project has been in this country. Because when you have MPs or MEPs or members of council from these parties, they thrive off a fear of other cultures and that people want to be homogenous in the way that they work and the way that they live and the people that they see on the street. My cousin is a gentleman who has a very scarily different upbringing to myself. I've moved from university to university following an academic father and has lived very much in an ivory tower, whereas he has not. He's grappled with unemployment. He's been expelled from several schools. He's even managed to have a spell in prison as well. And he's also an individual who voted for the BNP. And upon knowing that I was going to be speaking in this debate on this side, one that I wouldn't normally be inclined to, I had to have a talk to him about his experiences living in that place. And again, I'm sorry, but I have to disagree with the honourable lady on the other side. But he told me stories about going into pubs where the girls that he would who he would go with were insulted and told that they were worthless because they're white and that white girls are sluts and they're not worth anything and they're only good enough for people to sleep with. That's what he saw as a problem, and he didn't like the idea that the people who were telling him this and that they were telling the women that he cared about in his life, the people who were telling them that were all people that he identified as coming from the Indian subcontinent. Now that might not obviously be a cultural link, but people do, when they see people of different skin color, immediately make a cultural connection that they judge them on. Those might be flawed judgments and flawed preconceptions, but they're still ones that people act on. And when they see these people similarly in the way that they feel like taking their jobs or putting their livelihoods at risk, when they are families that have been there for generations and that have always been told, this is the home that you have, you will live on this street, this is the job that you will get, and these are the people that you grew up, when all of that is put at risk, it's a very scary prospect. And at some point, even though I might find that difficult to fathom, I have to climb down from my ivory tower and say that maybe he has a point. Maybe he has a reason to be fearful and one that we have to engage with. And to turn around and say, no, this project's fine, everyone's getting along grand, and it's all lollipops and rainbows and smiles, is just a lie. And anyone who lives north of the M25 or has experienced kind of life in other spheres probably will have an inkling or at least know someone who could tell them something similar. I remember growing up in Glasgow hearing stories about kind of people coming in waiting for asylum getting stabbed on the street purely because they were wearing a turban. And that's ridiculous. That isn't a multicultural project. Yeah, sure.
Ben Jones, Homerton. I think you've really mischaracterised the UK. I think you've taken some really, the most extreme examples. I'm not even sure if some of the things you've said have ever happened. But I think you've taken, a really, and particularly to say, people living, say, north of the M25. I think most people don't actually make judgments based on, in Britain, based on people's skin colour. In my own experience, living in Manchester. I really think to make your case, you haven't actually taken a very accurate view of the UK.
Like, I understand the point you're saying. There are lots of people who won't make those judgments. Similarly, there are lots of people who are. And I think to say that it's working, we have to recognize, or rather say that it's not working, we have to say that there are enough problems that we are concerned enough about to say that it's not working yet. It's definitely a project that I would want to work towards and one that I very much believe in, but it's not one that I would say is working yet. In the same way that many feminists would say feminism is something that I believe in and something I want to work towards. I want there to be equality. It doesn't mean it's been achieved yet. And all I want to do is stand up and say, here are a range of problems that you can read about in newspaper archives if you don't believe they've happened, and say that they concern me enough to say that I don't want to pretend that this isn't a problem, and actually is one that I'd far rather engage with. Because in my experience, and in kind of things that I've read and so on, problems become far more insidious, far more problematic, and far harder to solve when we pretend they're not there, and when they get swept under the rug, and when they happen kind of on the brinks of society. They become much harder to deal with than when we turn around and engage with them directly and say, these are issues. They might be extreme circumstances, but there are enough extreme circumstances that we should be worried about them. And that's what I'm trying to focus on in my speech today. Many people in this room will never be directly harmed or have to deal with these problems, but there are many people who aren't in this room who do. And in these sorts of debates, and this is something that seems quite strange to some. In these sorts of debates, it's important to highlight awareness and talk about those problems in order for everyone in this room to then go out and talk about them a little bit more and just consider them a little bit more and perhaps cause that wider impact. That's the importance that they are here. So thanks very much for your question on that. And I would like to talk a little bit more about this idea of money, because I think economics is very much intrinsically linked with these problems when people talk about race, because they are worried about job security. People, in places where you get a lot of rhetoric about cultures or people wanting to be homogenous in kind of race and culture in that sort of way, it's because, thanks very much, they feel at risk for their jobs and their livelihoods. They fear about the future of their children. I think that is a massive part to play in it. And perhaps one of the things that we could do to go somewhere to make this project work more is try and separate further those ideas of economics and culture to make them more independent so people can engage with them separately so they don't cohese, that should be a word, but it isn't, those sorts of problems and identify on that sort of basis. So that's basically kind of what I wanted to talk about today. That fear of the unknown is a problem, and that when people see people of different skin colors and immediate visual triggers on the street that they identify as different, sometimes they can be fearful of that, and sometimes they can react badly because of bad experiences that they've had in the past. That might not be everywhere, and it probably isn't for most people, but it is for enough people that we should be concerned. So I beg to propose the motion.
Thank you, Fletch. To continue the case for the opposition is Rex Urbano. Rex is a writer whose work focuses largely on socio-political issues and is most famous for writing Somebody's Son and, as was mentioned earlier, Rasta Mouse. Rex.
Hello, everyone. How are you all doing, all right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and an honor to be here, it really is. I'm not a politician or an academic. I'm a writer. But above all, I'm British. I'm not going to argue that we live in a multicultural society. I'm going to argue that we live in a multicultural society. It isn't perfect, but it's certainly working, and it hasn't failed. As a writer, one tends to write about what one knows. If I look to my own family, I can say that I'm black British, born to Nigerian parents. My wife is half Asian and half English, and we're about to have a baby who will be half Nigerian, a quarter English, and a quarter Asian. Our child will also have grandparents who are Hindu, Christian, and atheist. And we all live in the UK. I'm not saying that we're representative, but in this country, our relationship is not only possible, but it's becoming more common with every new generation. In order to argue whether multiculturalism has succeeded or failed, the first thing we need to define is what it is. I mean, that isn't easy. It can affect people in different ways and in different degrees. Some people are reminded of multiculturalism on a daily basis. Perhaps if you've never worked in an inner city McDonald's, if you only wear a high vis when you're riding a bike, apart from that guy over there. Where did he come from? And there's another guy over there, oh dear. And if you've never thought about which box to tick on an equal opportunities form, the Oxford English Dictionary, sorry. The Cambridge English Dictionary defines multiculturalism as a doctrine that several different cultures, rather than one national culture, can coexist peacefully and equitably in a single country. Peacefully and equitably. But how do we measure that? Particularly when multiculturalism means many things to many people, and particularly when arguments for and against it are often mediated by the context or agenda in which it's being discussed. The journalist and critic Yasmin Alibai-Brown, who is a Ugandan Asian immigrant, will have a perspective based on her own experiences of life in the UK. She says that multiculturalism is irredeemable and irreversible. The Daily Mail columnist Melanie Phillips argues that it is a form of reverse racism and is sickeningly hypocritical. Trevor Phillips, no relation, the former chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, thinks that multiculturalism should be scrapped. For me, multiculturalism is an irrefutable way of modern life. Multicultural describes the society that we inhabit. It is the outcome of irreversible historical circumstances, and to that extent has become natural and inescapable. Cultures have been mixing and influencing in Britain for thousands of years. All Britain's history is a history of migration. Britain is not exactly the same place as it was last year. So looking back to a monolithic, green and pleasant land is pointless. It never existed apart from in the minds of certain individuals. Thank you. Now, where's page 4? Thank you. I would argue that a distinction needs to be made between multiculturalism and state multiculturalism. And therefore, it is not a question of multiculturalism has succeeded or failed. History cannot fail. But the attempt to manage it, organize it, monitor it, and effect it, in other words, state multiculturalism has failed. In fact, I would go as far as to say that multiculturalism has been compromised by state multiculturalism. David Cameron in his speech, not the one he made yesterday, but the one he made a few years ago in the Munich Security Conference, condemned Islamist extremism and partly blamed its rise in Britain on state multiculturalism. As I understand it, state multiculturalism is a political practice that came about in the 1970s and 80s. Ray Honeyford, who ran a school in Bradford where the ethnic minority rose to, in 1986, to 94%, started to pursue a policy that might be described as inculcating a core of Britishness. He said the children knew they were Asian or Muslim, but they didn't know they were British. So he taught them basic stuff about Britain and British history, and he also did other things like teach them how to swim. Eventually, this practice developed into granting financial aid for artistic groups based solely on ethnic background, public services translating documents into numerous languages, and leading people to go about their daily lives without ever learning English, and overall treating people like monolithic blocks by ticking boxes rather than individual citizens. State multiculturalism has divided people via the aforementioned methods, rather than bringing people together. But on top of that, the reason that Cameron uses to condemn state multiculturalism, which is flawed as I'm arguing, are not in fact problems isolated within British society, but problems facing the world in general. Fundamentalism, for example. For many people, the successes of multiculturalism was awarding the 2012 Olympics to London in 6/7. But one day after, 7/7, signalled the failure of multiculturalism in the minds of people like Cameron. So too has the recent burning of poppies, arguments about Sharia law in Britain, and other forms of extremism. But neither multiculturalism nor state multiculturalism can be blamed for this. Fundamentalism has arisen out of a combination of social malaise, inequalities that reach beyond the cultural, and the activities of governments like Britain and America abroad. Cameron blames separatism on multiculturalism, a convenient scapegoat. But the causes of separatism must be sought in years of social oppression, alienation, political and economic discrimination. Take Northern Ireland, which is yet again being torn apart by separatism. Rather than being condemned as a failed part of this country, there is a Secretary of State in Britain whose role it is to try and reach out an equitable solution. Where is the same effort to reach an equitable solution to those Britons whose religion is not Western? In fact, people like Cameron argue that what we need is a stronger national identity. 1 minute. Okay, stronger national identity. But and that will prevent extremism. But it isn't true. Because the more we're entrenched, we become in a particular identity, the less we are able to empathize with another. Isn't tolerance and flexibility what British identity is all about? For me, there is no incompatibility between multiculturalism and Britishness. You're going to have to go, and you. In closing, ironically, because I don't feel fear and feeling uncomfortable by saying that I'm British. Sorry, I've skipped a bit. Even though I started at the beginning saying that above all I am British, I feel uncomfortable to say it, not because Britishness seems to bring to mind our colonial past, but Britishness is something that I think about consciously. It is more of a subconscious feeling, a feeling of being at home, of belonging. And ironically, because I don't feel the fear of feeling uncomfortable by saying I'm British, it reveals to me that multiculturalism is working. I asked a friend of mine if he felt British, and he said, I thought I did until you asked me, but now I'm not so sure. Asking the question raises doubt, like asking those questions on equal opportunities forms. Multiculturalism is working, but it is a continuous struggle, like the struggle for a better democracy in an ever-changing world, in an ever-changing Britain. Thank you very much.
We will take another floor round now. Same drill as before. If you'd like to make a speech, please wait for a microphone to reach you first. Keep your speeches to a maximum of 1 minute and state your name and college before you speak. So does anyone have another point they'd like to make in proposition of the motion, i.e. that multiculturalism isn't working? At the back.
Ryan Frost from Christ College. I think that multiculturalism isn't working or has failed Britain because the kind that we were talking about is the kind that the last speaker mentioned, the state multiculturalism, where we're putting rather forced ideas of statehood or a shared identity when really everyone that we're trying to group or treat as a collective are wildly variant in their beliefs or different in that case. So I think when we do try to push this collective idea, are we portraying an authentic subculture or culture, or are we just portraying a cultural stereotype and a more conceited idea? For example, the joke with the Cambridge Oxford English Dictionary, we're inherently made to believe that we are fiercely different from Oxford, and we try to heighten our differences, just as any culture does with another, and we're forced to heighten the differences when in fact we're rather quite similar. It's probably quite an unpopular thing to say, but yeah. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think we're putting too much emphasis on these collective identities that we're made to believe that we share, and I think the integration. The integration comes more naturally, and we should just let it develop like that because we've got a global community. So I think if we drop the idea of conceited statehood, national identity, it will be okay.
Thank you, Ryan. Can we have a point in opposition, please? Up in the gallery, please.
I'm India Matharu Daly, and I'm from St John's College. Matharu is Indian, and Daly is Anglo-Irish, so I like to think, that maybe I'm a product of the multiculturalism of this country. I think multiculturalism in Britain is when we can accept that two cultures can coincide and mix. Mr. IONIDES talked about a better alternative to multiculturalism being submitting to one monoculture. And in my opinion, that's not only boring, but when you pit the cultures together and say that one is better than the other, and they can't coexist, that's when conflicts between cultures arise. So I can be British and Indian, but let's look at Northern Ireland. You can't be Protestant and Catholic, and that's why I think that problem is more difficult to solve than the multicultural issues we have in Britain.
Thank you. Would anyone like to speak in abstention of the motion? Hand right up down there.
James Bailey, Pembroke College. Essentially, the issue we have here. Thank you. Hello? Wow. The issue we have here isn't just a question of multiculturalism and the many, many debates we're having over what multiculturalism is. There's also the question of what is your alternative. So if you are saying, we need to people to come together around some sort of idea of Britishness, what the heck is Britishness? I mean, for me, I can tell you what it means to me to be British, but I mean, for me, I'm somebody who is relatively liberal, who is relatively left-wing. For me, Britishness implies a certain amount of egalitarianism. For me, being British implies the very strong commitments I have to the equal rights of women and the equal rights of the LGBT community. But at the same time, I know that there are people who believe very strongly that they have their idea of Britishness, which is, for example, based on the fact that we still have today a state church which does not believe in those very things I just put forward and discriminates very strongly at its most highest structural levels. So unless we can come up with an idea of what British culture is, I don't see how we can say that there is any kind of fundamental debate here, because you can't see where multiculturalism is and isn't working unless you can define the cultural units within it.
We'll do one more quick round. Anyone have another point in proposition? Yeah.
Greg Burke, St John's. The problem is that we've let too many migrants with low skills enter the UK, and these migrants tend to, just purely out of economic necessity, congregate in poorer areas together where education is poorer and crime is higher. And so, due to this link between their background and also their economic fortune, the people in these areas may actually think the fact that they're downtrodden is due to their background, ethnic background, rather than economic background, and that also, this division also allows stereotypes to flourish because immigrants are connected with society's problems. So we get caught in a trap that I feel is irresolvable and that will only worsen and perpetuate itself over time. So for that reason, multiculturalism has failed.
Thank you. A final point in opposition, please. Over there, please. In the corner, Johnny. In the corner.
Robin Azinovich, St. Catherine's College. So we've heard a lot about definitions of multiculturalism. In less than 1 minute now, I'll introduce my own. Multiculturalism works because it has to work. People of different cultures get together. They get in touch with one another, internationally, in the UN and in the EU, and everybody's exposed to this through the media. Nationally, in London, for example, which is the financial center of the world, where everybody comes together, or here in this very university, where people from all over the world live together, learn together, and work together. And people do that because they have no other choice. They are dependent of one another. The states at the UN level, and we, the students, at the Cambridge University level. Even if we are self-interested, we know that our self-interest demands us to cooperate with others, to work with them, and then we work together. And what does that lead to? That leads to the relativism of our own culture, of our own further absolute, earlier absolute, now relative culture, because we are aware of other cultures, we are interested in them or curious, or even if we're not, we try to understand them because we have to understand them, because we have to work with them, and then our own culture is but a relativity. It's not absolute anymore. We have our own culture, but in the context of other cultures, and therefore we have multiculturalism of mind, and this applies not only to the state, but to every one of us. Thank you very much.
A final point in abstention, please, someone. Just at the front.
Hi, Patrick Flynn, St. Cat's. Not only do we have a problem because we've had like 7 different definitions of multiculturalism, but also inherent in the debate, you kind of have to define what culture is, and that's such a broad term. I mean, I can kind of walk down the street past 7 different cultural restaurants, go to a museum, see loads of different types of art from different cultures. I can be like, wow, your culture is fascinating, look at your history. But then at the same time, when things get difficult, people can kind of turn on people, and I don't know, America's been flagged up as a really good sort of, yes, multiculturalism type of place, but you can go to places in the South and then you can say, oh, there are too many Hispanics, like, what's up with this? And people can kind of take and choose, and I don't know, I'm just kind of lost.
Thank you for all your floor speeches. We want to get back to the main debate. Closing the case for the proposition is Superintendent Leroy Logan. Leroy is a founder and former chair of the Black Police Association. Leroy.
Can anyone hear me? No? Okay. It's going to be a short speech then. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to be here. And, of course, the warm welcome you've given us. It was, not to mention the meal. So, thank you very much for that. I'll go anywhere for a free meal. Maybe that's why I've accepted your third invite. The second one I couldn't make, but so I feel I'm at home here. So please don't give me a hard time. The last time I was here was the week before Dominic Strauss-Kahn was here, and I saw on the TV what a reception you gave him. So I'm glad I got away very lightly. I grew up in the 60s. Well, I was born in the 50s, grew up in the 60s and 70s. And my backdrop was Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. And if there was any a time when multiculturalism had its legs done, it was through that. And I remember when the fear factor for being black or a minority, African, Caribbean, whatever, was that you could only really feel an affinity with your own. So all of a sudden, you had the isolationism. Maybe not to the extent what we see now, but it was a factor even for me when I wanted to join the police service. Because in the 60s, there was actually a colour bar. You weren't allowed to join the police service if you were black. It was actually debated in Parliament. So with those sort of barriers, very, very institutionalized, I take the point that Rex said, that state multiculturalism has been the biggest challenge for us all. So that when we talk about multiculturalism, the last person who spoke around confusion is because no one has actually created a consensus. And above all, I didn't know there was a pass or fail to say, has it worked or not? So there we are. We're in total confusion and we don't know what we're talking about. However, I think the motion is definitely a clear, I mean, the rest of my team has done a really good job to say that the motion is carried. So I don't know how the vote's going to go, but I think we've already won. I think the issues that we're grappling with now in terms of the urban ghettos. I as a police officer, I've been based in London, in all deprived areas, some affluent, like Hampstead, and I've seen some real isolationism. I've seen young people, they have no hope, they have no aspirations. They are living a parallel universe. They have their own language. You know what I mean, blood? Whatever that means. No, Rex, I know you know. That's the only thing we're going to agree about on this one. And I then saw 9/11, and that blew multiculturalism out the water. All of a sudden, racial profiling came out. And it wasn't just policing. We saw it in airports, transport hubs. All of a sudden, again, like slavery, your color was a factor. So let's not fool ourselves that we're living in this twilight zone. Everyone gets on. However, there's certain environments where it allows people to speak openly and be themselves, like this forum. And I take that point that was said earlier. Here is a classic example of multiculturalism working. You're here to study. You're here to learn from your fellow students. And as a result of that, you're open to the possibility of not just tolerating, but actually accepting one another. A lot of it is actually, that's a good student. They know what they're doing. I'm going to run alongside them because they might help me with my homework. No, I'm joking. But, you know, that's mutual respect. And I think that's one factor that we haven't brought in is what is the environment? I'm going to close, even though I've got about 4 minutes. 3, okay. Around the environment I have had to live through for the last 30 years as a cop. And I'm retiring in July, and I can't wait, because the culture I've been having to live in is the worst environment for multiculturalism. The default position in the police is the fact that they don't celebrate diversity. In fact, the default position is white, male, and stale. That's it. Their world is in that zone. So when it comes to a person of color and coming with my own principles and values, I was married with a child, I've been a research scientist, so I wasn't your stereotypical copper, PC plod. I'm challenging, and as a result of that, took it to the next level and started the Black Police Association. Wow, did that create uproar, especially when we gave evidence at the Lawrence inquiry and said that police was institutionally racist, because that environment is racist. It does not celebrate diversity. It doesn't know anything about multiculturalism. They can't spell it. That's why they're thinking about bringing cops from the States or wherever to be commissioner. Even though you can tell Hogan Howe this when he comes in the next few weeks. Obviously, they didn't know he was coming in the next few weeks. I would just say, in closing, that I think the debate's been great, but I think there's a factor in all of this. It depends where you exist. Will multiculturalism work? It works in my house. My wife is Nigerian, half Jewish. I'm Jamaican. So it's a similar mix in reverse somewhat. So it's got to work. It's been working for the last 30 years. Depends how you work at it. What is your mindset? I know in the police service, it doesn't work until someone shows the right sort of leadership. And we're getting there. So that's the factor. When you can create an environment for multiculturalism, diversity, celebrating it, that's when you can say it works. But in all honesty, it's not going to happen. You're not going to create that environment. Trust me, whoever, really enjoy your environment here. Because when you get into the real world, you will find out that environment does not allow the sweet aroma of diversity to be celebrated. And I suggest you support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leroy. Our final speaker tonight is Paul Uppal. Paul is the first Conservative Sikh MP, the current Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton South. That constituency was once represented by a certain Mr. Enoch Powell, but I've got a feeling Paul will be making a slightly different speech tonight. Paul.
You're right, I will actually be making a slightly different speech that Enoch would probably be making this evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming along this evening. It's a great honour to actually be here at such an illustrious university and speaking such a wonderful debate which has so much history. I'm actually going to change my speech. The thing about when you go last on these debates is that that does actually give you a privilege. Partly, I think my speech has already been delivered by the young lady upstairs. I have a Christian first name, Paul, and a Sikh surname. But I'm just going to diverge from that point and talk about Enoch Powell. It would be churlish of me not to, wouldn't it, really? Enoch Powell won the constituency of Wolverhampton South West in the 1950 general election. His majority to the number was 691. I am an East African Sikh, born in Smethwick. I won the seat of Wolverhampton South West with a majority in 2010 of 691. It's a funny game, politics, sometimes, but there are some sweet ironies in life. I actually spoke to Enoch's widow, Pam Powell, and people who were in the room in the Midland Hotel when Enoch delivered that Rivers of Powell speech on the 20th of April, 1968. Because I wanted to know what drove him to make that speech. And we could have another debate about what drove him on all sorts of issues. Did he covet power? Did he generally feel the concerns that he was expressing? Was he following Peter Griffith, who championed this issue in 1964? But I believe that he had a fear of communalism. And it was driven by partition in India in 1947, where he saw families who had lived cheek by jowl for generations, for hundreds of years, torn asunder, torn apart, overnight, a collective madness. In fact, one of the most famous elements of the speech is, "We must be mad, literally mad." I think it was quoted from a civil servant who'd written to him at the time. And when you compare that speech, which was born out of those flames of such brutality of partition, and you look at modern India now, and there'll be a reason for why I'm saying all this, trust me, it will come back to a fundamental point. That young country, which had such a brutal birth, has grown up into a young, beautiful country now, where actually the majority of people live cheek by jowl, quite peaceably and quite harmoniously. At that time in 1947, my maternal grandfather stood outside a house full of Muslims, which was besieged by a Sikh mob who were actually going to burn them out. He stood there, he said, "If anybody attacked this household, they attacked my family." It is a great source of pride to me that that Muslim family is still there in that village in Punjab to this day. And I think really that taps into that whole spirit of what we talk about here on multiculturalism, on the human spirit of our connection as human beings. I think it was Charlie, I don't know where he is, he spoke about a definition of the global connections that we make today from Emmanuel College. I think you were over there, Charlie. And I think that's very, very, very important. That as I am very fortunate to be a member of Parliament for the last 2.5 years, I get to meet very interesting folk from all over the world. And actually, although we may try and conceitedly define ourselves, we all have the same things. We want to see ourselves as special. We all want to be loved. We all want to feel valued. But essentially, there's not a great deal of difference between us all. Everybody's had a go at defining multiculturalism. So I think I'll probably be the 9th or the 10th go. So here's my definition. When we debate multiculturalism and assess whether it has succeeded, succeeding, failing, or failed in outline, what we firstly understand by multiculturalism, without setting a definition of it, which should test this point of this debate, would be meaningless. My own definition of multiculturalism is one where religious and ethnic minorities are allowed to value, observe, and celebrate your own heritage and culture whilst recognizing you're part of a wider society. What can anybody, in terms of this debate, add to it? Well, I'm going to give you my own personal narrative. I was born, one of 2 children, but lived in a terrace house in Smethwick. There were 8 children there. We shared it with my uncle. I went to school, primary school, in southwest Birmingham, an area called Northfield. For the first few years of my time in primary school, I was actually kept in a special class because the teachers thought I actually couldn't speak English. It wasn't until a teacher called Mr. Breeden spent 30 seconds of his time and spoke to me and said, "Paul, you can actually speak English." So I said, "Yes, sir, I can read it as well." Who knows what would have happened if I hadn't had that 30-second conversation? I probably wouldn't be standing here in front of you today. I would walk from home to school, and on half a dozen occasions, I'd be told to go home. I'd be described as filthy, dirty, and the P word would be used occasionally. At the age of 11, I remember one of my earliest memories, sitting in a technical drawing class, and the deputy headmaster, and I kid you not on this, I'm not going to soft soap it, asking all my schoolmates of what they were going to do that evening. Is anybody going packy bashing tonight? I remember as a young boy standing there, and I froze, and I was doing the little line across, and it just dropped at the end. I compare that to what my son experiences today. He has no concept of people being different colors. He sees it, of course, he visualizes it, but he sees them as other human beings. Our next door neighbor is a young friend of my son called Matthew. He spends time with us. We make Indian food together. We consume it. And one of the most heartening things I've found over the last few years is when he looks at us and we discuss things and he said, "Do you know what? This is a fantastic family structure you've got here, Cameron." Sorry, my son is called Cameron. That wasn't a sycophantic thing. He's 15 years old, and he was born long before we had the current leader of the Conservative Party. It's just a quirk of fate. Really, trust me, folks, if I could predict things like that, I really wouldn't be here. but that's a different conversation. And in essence, both Cameron and Matthew, when they discuss things, have taken the best of both worlds. Matthew has taken the odd bit of Indian Punjabi culture, and Cameron takes the best bit of what he sees as his traditional British values. And what are these values? What is traditional British values? Is it, for me, it was John Cleese in Fawlty Towers, being essentially quintessentially British. And when I talk to my children about what I enjoy about 1970s TV, because I'm a big fan of this, it is actually traditional farce. It is sarcasm. I know in parts of the Deep South, I think there's one of the American comedians who uses this point. If you use sarcasm or irony, it's actually similar to witchcraft. But it is quintessentially British humour. And when I travel abroad, do you know, when they see a brown face and I give a deadpan response and I don't show any humour at all on it, they love it. Because essentially, that's combining the best of both worlds. And that's what I see, as I think was raised by the initial point there. I take the best of my Indian values and I take the best of my British values. But those values and that concept of culture is not static. It's not boring. It's always constantly changing. I think that's a problem with this. If we view it as this, through these halcyon perspective of what traditional British values were, I think we actually lose one of the main drivers in this whole debate. Culture, values. The world is an incredibly different place. In my lifetime, I am somebody who's come from an immigrant background representing Wolverhampton South West, which was Enoch Powell's seat. Incredibly ethnically diverse. It goes quickly, doesn't it? And I look at my children and the opportunities they have. And increasingly, I see the world as a much smaller place. I haven't paid any attention to the speech I'd written about this, but I'm going to sum it up in this way. I've used a personal anecdotal response in my speech. I'm a great film buff. I love watching TV and also films as well. One of the bits I really love is, I know some of you may like the film Good Will Hunting. And there's the bit there with Robin Williams when he's talking to Matt Damon. And Matt Damon's this incredibly bright kid, probably as there are this evening. I'm probably surrounded by them. And there's a painting on the wall. And it's actually a guy in a rowing boat going through the ocean, and he's lost. And Matt Damon basically takes Robin Williams apart, and he says, look, that represented the loss of your wife. And Robin Williams just takes a step back on this. And he just can't get this around his head. This young kid's walked into his office, never met him before, and he's just assessed him, analysed him, and taken him apart. And the next day he comes to meet him, and he doesn't know how to deal with this kid. And he says, you know what? When you spoke to me yesterday, you really shook me. But I realise you read it in a book. You didn't experience it, you didn't live it, you read it in a book. And part of the whole process with this, and why I wanted to say this message tonight, is through my lifetime, I've actually lived some of this. And I can tell you on that journey from where I've come to where I've arrived, I think this country, in terms of relationship and its concept of multiculturalism, has moved a long, long way. And that's why tonight I will be opposing the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That is the end of our debate tonight, but it's the start of a big week at the Union. Tomorrow night we have the unique party that is denim. For those of you who have got tickets, you should have got an email about how to collect it. Next Tuesday, James Haskell, the current England rugby star, will be speaking here. And next Thursday, do not miss Richard Dawkins taking on Rowan Williams on the topic of religion in the 21st century. Thank you to all our speakers. As ever, the door by which you leave is significant. Eyes to the right, nose to the left, and abstentions down the middle. Thank you.